man. I do what I do.
Okay, and this leads to a potential overreach in prosecuting consensual acts that are deemed exploitative due to the disparity of wealth. The mere fact that you have more money than this broke person, right? And they give you the goods. That in itself means that vitiates consent. There's no way you can have consent from a poor person. Now, if the legal system begins to criminalize these dynamics, it could deter consensual relationships between people from different economic backgrounds. In other words, if you got some money, you got two nickels to rub together, you better leave them broke people alone. Because you having a sexual relationship with them is deemed as by default non-consensual. Think about that. Even if they consent, they're not really consenting. Even if she say, cool, no problem, she's not. Think about that. And what is that going to do? That's going to create it's going to do the same thing that Me Too did. It's going to create an environment of fear where consensual interactions are scrutinized and potentially stifling personal freedoms. Lawsuits are going to happen. And what we're looking at is the intersection of consent, wealth, and morality, and it poses significant ethical questions. Society is going to have to grapple with whether it's fair to label consensual acts as crimes based on economic disparities and what that means for personal freedoms and societal norms. And this situation could set a precedent. This one with P. Diddy, it sets a precedent where financial influence is criminalized in personal relationship. And that's going to have a chilling effect on sexual freedoms and the ability of people to engage in consensual relationships across economic lives. See, the legal treatment of consensual relationships involving wealth and power dynamic raises fundamental questions about autonomy, consent, and the role of socioeconomic factors in personal interactions. It invites a critical examination of how laws are applied and whether they appropriately reflect the complexities of the human relationship. Now, I know this is going over some people's heads, okay? But this argument raises significant concerns about societal perceptions of poverty and autonomy and consent. It suggests that the allure of money, somebody type money in the chat room, the allure of money can create a dynamic where people, poor people, and we'll just say poor women or poor men from lower socioeconomic backgrounds will be viewed as lacking agency to make informed decisions. In other words, poor people can't think for themselves. That's basically what this is saying. That's basically what the Southern District of New York is saying. These poor women who were compensated, these poor men who were paid to participate in P. Diddy's freak off, they couldn't think for themselves. They were coerced by his money. They lack agency and they can't make informed choices, particularly in sexual relationships. Now, here's a deeper exploration of this perspective. Viewing poor people as unable to resist the allure of wealth implies a lack of agency and power. In other words, you so poor you can't say no. So anything I want to do to you, anything you volunteer to do, if somebody else in society says, that was immoral, there's no way they would have consented to that based on how I feel. So it must be a crime in there. It was coercion. And this perspective can perpetuate stereotypes that poor people are inherently vulnerable. And that undermines their capacity to make autonomous decisions. Okay? And it reduces complex human experience to simplistic narratives of manipulation and exploitation. What it's really saying is that everybody can be bought. Shout out to my man, Demetrius Owens. This is what they're doing to P. This is the experiment that they're doing with P. Diddy right now. Here's another thing. I see what's perpetuated here, the victim narrative. And this framing can lead to a systematic view of poor people as perpetual victims. It suggests that they can't make rational choices. And it reinforces the narrative that strips them of their dignity and the ability to exercise personal agency. And this viewpoint can be patronizing and positioning wealthy people, rich people as predators, and poor people as poor victims without recognizing their autonomy. In other words, what they're saying is, if you poor, you can't think for yourself. If you poor, you're a natural victim. What if you poor with a pistol? What if you poor with a gun? The poor person is all. So next time somebody commits a crime, instead of asking the facts of the crime, we got to go look at their bank accounts and their holdings to determine whether or not they were a predestined victim or not. I want y'all to think about that, man. See, by implying that the financial desperation renders a person incapable of consent, society is imposing moral judgments on relationships between rich people and poor people. And this can create a stigma around consensual interactions, suggesting that they're inherently exploitative, regardless of the actual dynamics at play. You got a business, and you done well for yourself. You start people off at minimum wage. Well, 2 weeks after hiring your newest 2-week hire, they send you a lawsuit and say, well, you're rich and I'm poor, and you paying me these wages is inherently unfair. And so now you got to give me a raise and make sure I get paid $40 an hour, even though I just got here 2 weeks ago. Because again, by implying that financial desperation renders people incapable of consent, society is imposing moral judgment, and it's basically saying that it's inherently exploitative. This is how far this would go. If society accepts that poor people cannot truly consent due to financial pressures, this could lead to policies that further criminalize consensual relationships across economic lines. Laws can focus on protecting the vulnerable rather than recognizing the complexities of consent among consenting adults. And that's going to lead to overreach. The other thing it's going to do, I want y'all to hear me. You better leave them broke women alone. Because if this is the direction that we're heading in, this perspective, it's going to exacerbate the class divides by framing wealth as a corrupting influence. The mere fact that you have money, now you corrupt. You were good yesterday, but you won the lottery today. And so now that you're rich, you're corrupt. And it positions rich people, affluent people, as morally suspect for their financial power. The fact that you have money, it suggests that wealth is inherently corrupts relationships. And this can foster resentment and misunderstanding between socioeconomic classes, and as opposed to encouraging dialogue amongst economic inequality. Somebody type "eat the rich" in the chat room. TIQ has excellent analysis so far on you cooking at Hot Texas Barbecue. Yeah, man. Now, if society views poor people as unable to make choices free from coercion, it can hinder their opportunities for social mobility. It suggests a fixed narrative where financial status dictates personal worth and capability, rather than recognizing the resilience and agency many people from lower class economic backgrounds possess. In other words, look, we just gonna write you off top because you're broke. You're broke, and therefore what you have to say is meaningless. So we're gonna strip your right to vote away, because not only are you a victim, but you don't have the mental capacity to even consent to what happens to your body. See, the notion that poor people's rights to make their own decisions should be stripped away based on their economic status raises significant ethical, moral questions. Because again, with the responsibility, right, becomes you got obligations. If we can't even hold you responsible for what you do with your sexual organs, we certainly can't give you the right to vote, right? And there are going to be people who say, well, we should strip away their rights. The belief that poor people are inherently vulnerable, which is what this whole P. Diddy lawsuit is saying, that he was rich and they were poor, and because they were poor and he had money, they were inherently vulnerable and subject to his coercion. What does that say in the inverse? It says that poor people are inherently vulnerable, and that can lead to others who argue that their decision-making capabilities should be limited or stripped away. We have to treat them like children.